So before we can do our dovetail machining of our finished part, I'll hide these two sketches, of our finished part from our dovetail stock, we first of all need to prepare that dovetail stock from raw stock. And to do that, we need to use the fixture plate setup, which is this. Hide that. There you go. Now, there are a number of ways we can set up the file to do this. The easiest and simplest way is just to take our raw stock component and dovetail stock component from here and position them on this fixture plate. However, the downside of that is that when you then go into the manufacturing workspace, the dovetail stock that you want to use for your dovetail setup will be the same stock that you want to use in your fixture plate setup. So you're constantly having to move the timeline back and forward to get the stock in the right position depending on which machining you're wanting to do. So that can make the file a bit confusing and a bit complicated when you're constantly having to move the timeline back and forward. The second way to do it is to derive the raw stock and the dovetail stock. If I go to the top and make everything visible. There you go. Make that visible. Hide this for the moment. So yeah, we can derive the raw stock and the dovetail stock into its own file, so it'll appear in here in its own file, which is great because it means that then it keeps everything simple, keeps all the dovetail stuff in one design file, and then you'd have the preparation of the dovetail stock in another design file using the fixture plate setup, so you know exactly which file to use for whichever piece of machining you want to do. However, I'd warn against that because when you derive from an already derived file, which is what we're doing here because we're in a derived file, it means that any changes you make to the master file, which is where all these parts come from, you'll then have to save that master file, then go into this derived file, update it, there'll be a little yellow warning that appears here, click update, then save that before those changes will then flow down into your second derived file, which is derived from an already derived file. So you're creating quite a long chain. So if you forget to go into that middle derived file and update it, those updates won't flow through into the file that has these derived parts in it. Hopefully that makes sense, but I'm really just saying don't derive from an already derived file. It can make things a little bit confusing. If you think you'd remember to do that, or if you think you can come up with a clever naming scheme, which effectively tells you that you need to which files you need to update, then go ahead and do that. But personally, I don't like to do it because I might not remember. Instead, what I like to do is create two new components inside the fixture plate setup and copy the dovetail stock and raw stock into there. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to just going to select. There you go. Don't know why I'm stuck with this little sideways arrow here. It's normally for moving the timelines from side to side. There you go. So create component, new component, and I'll call them the same thing to avoid confusion. So dovetail stock. And I'll copy this body, copy into here. Okay. And then I'll create another component inside here, which will be my raw stock. Okay. Make that visible. Hide this. Hit copy. Select raw stock and hit paste. Okay. And now I'll hide that raw stock. Just minimize all that. Hide the dovetail setup and make the fixture plate setup visible. And select it. There we go. So now you see I've got the dovetail stock and the raw stock inside my fixture plate setup. And I can move these around knowing that it's not going to affect dovetail stock and raw stock within my dovetail setup. There's one really important thing to note here, which is that if I get the dovetail base up and make this visible, and I'm going to hide this, go to the top level, make everything visible. Right, this dovetail base is not jointed in any way to this DM12 block, so it's free moving, you can move it around, and that is done for a very deliberate reason. And that's because, as you've seen throughout these videos, I've been copying and pasting this dovetail base to create the other components. Now, if you have a joint, if I had a joint on this dovetail base, then that joint would also copy with the components. So I wouldn't be able to move this, but I also wouldn't be able to move any of the components which I made from copying it. So obviously, inside my fixture plate setup, I want to be able to move the dovetail stock around for machining and positioning it on the vise. So I will create joints after it's been copied into here, but I don't want it to be jointed up here. I don't want this dovetail base to be jointed, because then that joint would have copied through to this this dovetail stock. So just bear that in mind. There's a reason there isn't a joint on here, and just leave it so there isn't a joint, and make sure you don't. If you accidentally move a component, you normally get this up in the top right. So it'll say capture position or revert. So just click revert if you accidentally move it, and it'll go back to its previous position. Right, so I'll just make that visible again. I'll hide everything in here and minimize it. And that is my dovetail stock and raw stock copied across to my fixture plate setup.